John Mitchell was a man of the land, a third-generation farmer whose entire life had been dedicated to the soil beneath his feet. Every morning, before the sun had fully risen, he would step outside, inhale the crisp air, and prepare for another day of backbreaking labor. Farming wasn't just his profession, it was his identity, his legacy, and his family's lifeline. But in recent years, that lifeline had been thinning. The price of crops kept falling, fuel costs soared, and big corporations bought up farmland at an alarming rate, making it nearly impossible for independent farmers like John to survive. Banks saw small farmers as financial risks, refusing loans or offering terms so crushing that failure seemed inevitable. John watched as neighbors, fellow farmers who had once thrived, were forced to sell their land and leave behind generations of hard work. He had heard politicians make promises, but he had learned not to believe in words anymore. Words didn't pay the bills, didn't feed his children, and didn't stop the relentless decline of family farming. Still, there was a fire in John that refused to be extinguished. One night, after another long day in the fields, he sat at his kitchen table, staring at a blank sheet of paper. On the radio, another politician was making sweeping claims about helping the American worker, about protecting the backbone of the country. John scoffed. They had no idea what it meant to be a farmer, to put everything into the land and get so little in return. He picked up his pen and began to write. His words were direct, unfiltered, and unapologetic. He addressed the letter to President Donald Trump, a man known for his boldness, a man who prided himself on being different from career politicians. John laid out the struggles of small farmers, not with desperation, but with the honesty of someone who had nothing left to lose. He challenged the president to see it for himself, to step onto a real farm, not for a speech or a photo op, but to truly understand the crisis facing American agriculture. When he finished, he folded the letter, sealed it, and mailed it, not expecting anything to come of it. It was just one letter among thousands the White House received daily. Weeks passed, and John had almost forgotten about it. Then, early one morning, while he was repairing a section of his fence, his phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm, yet official. "Mr. Mitchell, the president has read your letter, and he's coming to your farm." John froze, gripping the phone tighter. "The president of the United States?" he repeated, almost in disbelief. "Yes, sir. He'll be there next week." The news spread quickly, sending a ripple through the small town. Some were skeptical, believing it was just another political stunt, a carefully orchestrated move for the cameras. Others were in awe that the leader of the free world would bother to visit an unknown farmer in the middle of nowhere. But John wasn't interested in the spectacle. He didn't care about the press or the attention. If Trump was coming, John was going to make sure he heard the truth. As the day approached, John prepared, not by cleaning up the farm for appearances, but by making sure the reality of his situation was on full display. When the presidential convoy finally arrived, a line of black SUVs kicking up dust on the country road, John wiped his hands on his overalls and stood firm, waiting. Secret Service agents poured out first, scanning the area with meticulous precision. Then, as the car door opened, President Trump stepped out, his expression unreadable behind his usual confidence. John took a deep breath, extended his hand, and met the president's gaze. "Mr. President," he said firmly, "I appreciate you coming, but I won't sugarcoat my words." Trump smirked slightly, shaking John's calloused hand. "I wouldn't expect anything less," he replied. The meeting had begun, and John was ready. The air was thick with tension as John Mitchell stood his ground, staring directly at President Donald Trump, who had just stepped out of his armored SUV. Around them, Secret Service agents scanned the area with calculated precision, their sharp eyes flicking over every inch of the land, assessing risks where John only saw soil, crops, and years of relentless labor. John had always believed in hard work, in rolling up his sleeves and pushing through adversity, but no amount of effort had been able to protect him and other small farmers from the crushing weight of economic struggles. He wasn't here to be polite, to entertain political pleasantries, or to offer empty gratitude. No, this was his one chance to speak the truth to the most powerful man in the country, and he wasn't going to waste it. Trump, ever confident, smirked slightly, adjusting his tie as he met John's firm gaze. "I appreciate the invitation," he said, his tone measured but carrying an undeniable edge of authority. John, however, wasn't interested in small talk. "Mr. President, politicians make big promises, but farmers are drowning. Prices keep dropping, fuel costs keep rising, and the corporations keep buying up everything in sight. Are you here to listen or just to talk?" The words came out sharper than intended, but John didn't regret them. He wasn't here to impress. He was here to be heard. Trump raised an eyebrow, clearly unaccustomed to being addressed so directly. "John, I respect farmers," he said, crossing his arms, "but things take time." John scoffed, shaking his head. "We don't have time," he shot back, his voice tinged with frustration. "Our land is suffering, our families are breaking under debt, and those big corporations you talk about, they're swallowing us whole. You say you've done more for farmers than any other president? Then why am I still struggling?" The air between them grew heavier, a quiet intensity settling over the conversation. The Secret Service agents exchanged uneasy glances, their postures tightening, as if preparing for an argument to escalate into something bigger. John didn't care. He had nothing to lose. From the porch, Lisa, John's wife, watched the exchange unfold, her hands twisting nervously in her apron. She had seen John fight before, seen his frustration boil over in conversations with bankers and local officials. But this was different. This wasn't just any man he was challenging. This was the President of the United States. Sensing the rising heat between them, she stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Gentlemen, let's sit down." It wasn't a request. Inside the modest farmhouse, the atmosphere shifted but remained charged. The kitchen smelled of fresh cornbread, and the worn wooden table in the center of the room bore the marks of countless meals and family discussions. As Trump took a seat, John walked over to the fridge, opening it to reveal its nearly barren shelves. "Mr. President," he said, his voice quieter but no less firm, "we grow food." John leaned forward, his rough hands resting on the table. "Big corporations," he answered without hesitation. "They buy up the land, they drive down prices, and they push us out. The banks won't give us fair loans, but they'll bail out the corporations every time. That's not competition, that's being crushed." Trump tapped his fingers against the table, considering the words carefully. "That's capitalism," he finally said, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice, as if he were questioning his own beliefs in real time. John clenched his jaw, holding back the frustration that threatened to boil over. "There's a difference between competition and being rigged to fail," he countered, "and right now the system is rigged." Lisa, standing by the stove, placed a plate in front of Trump, mashed potatoes, grilled chicken, and warm cornbread. "Mr. President," she said softly, "you should taste what struggling America really is." Trump picked up his fork, taking a thoughtful bite. He chewed in silence, the rich, homemade flavors hitting him in a way that White House meals never could. Lisa smiled sadly. "We sell this at the market," she said, "but we barely make enough to keep going." John exhaled, rubbing a tired hand over his face. "Farming isn't just a job, Mr. President, it's our life. Our kids should inherit this land, not debt." Trump looked around the home, his gaze lingering on family photos, on furniture that had seen years of wear, on the small cracks in the walls that told a silent story of struggle. For the first time, he wasn't in a boardroom or at a campaign rally. He was in the heart of America, where words weren't enough. He had to listen. John pushed his chair back and stood. "Come with me," he said. Trump, still chewing the last bite of cornbread, raised an eyebrow but followed. Outside, under the broad sky, John held up his hands, calloused, cracked, and dirt-stained. "These hands have worked this soil since I was a boy," he said. "My father's hands looked the same, and his before him." Trump studied them, taking in the evidence of years of labor. "Hard work," Trump acknowledged. John nodded. "But hard work alone isn't enough anymore." Trump exhaled, glancing out at the fields that stretched beyond them. "So what do you want from me?" John didn't hesitate. "Not handouts, not speeches. We need real change, policies that don't just favor corporations but protect us, the backbone of this country." For a moment, Trump was silent. Then, to John's surprise, A small smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "Ever driven a tractor?" John blinked at the sudden shift. "Not lately," Trump admitted. John gestured toward his old John Deere, a machine that had seen better days. "Hop in." Trump hesitated, then climbed up onto the seat. John handed him the controls, watching as the president gripped the wheel, maneuvering the heavy machine forward with careful concentration. It wasn't easy, and John saw something shift in Trump's expression as he realized just how much effort went into the work. John leaned in. "See, Mr. President, this is more than business. It's personal." Trump nodded, a rare look of reflection crossing his face. "I get it." John wasn't convinced yet. "Do you?" Trump looked out at the endless fields, his hand still gripping the wheel. "Maybe not fully," he admitted, "but I'm starting to." Inside the modest farmhouse, the weight of the conversation settled heavily in the air. The tension between John Mitchell and President Trump had not dissipated, but something had shifted. Trump, a man known for his confident, often brash responses, now sat at the worn wooden table, his fingers resting lightly on its surface as he looked around. The room was small, nothing like the grand spaces he was used to. The walls were adorned with faded family photos, generations of farmers standing proudly beside their land. The furniture was old but sturdy, marked with years of use, and in the corner a patched-up chair told a story of resilience, of making do with what little they had. Lisa moved about the kitchen with quiet efficiency, placing a plate of warm cornbread in front of the president. "Eat," she said simply. Trump picked up a piece, taking a bite, and for a moment there was silence. The taste was rich, comforting, homemade in a way that no White House meal could replicate. Lisa smiled sadly. "We sell this at the market," she said, "but barely make enough to cover our costs." Trump chewed thoughtfully, his usual quick responses absent. John leaned forward, his voice quieter but no less firm. "You say you respect farmers, Mr. President, but do you understand us?" Trump met his gaze, and for the first time there was no immediate rebuttal. John gestured around him. "This house, this land, it's everything to us. But the way things are going, my children won't inherit a farm. They'll inherit debt." He pushed back from the table and stood, motioning for Trump to follow. The president hesitated, then rose, trailing John out the back door and into the open fields. The cool evening air carried the scent of earth and grain, the sounds of distant machinery humming in the background. John stopped, turning to Trump before extending his hands. Calloused, cracked, and dirt-stained. "These hands," he said, his voice carrying a weight that needed no embellishment, "have worked this soil since I was a boy. My father's hands looked the same, his before him." Trump studied them, the deep lines, the rough skin, the evidence of a lifetime spent laboring under the sun. "Hard work," Trump acknowledged. John nodded. "But hard work alone isn't enough anymore," he said, shaking his head. "We aren't lazy, we don't ask for favors, but when banks treat us like risks, while corporations get bailouts, when prices are controlled by those who've never set foot on a farm, how do we stand a chance?" Trump exhaled, rubbing his chin. "The system is complicated," he admitted. John scoffed. "Not to us. It's simple. If we fail, America's food supply fails." Trump looked out over the land, his eyes tracing the fields that stretched endlessly before him. He had been in countless meetings about agriculture, had heard statistics, had signed off on policies meant to help, but now, standing here, he saw beyond the numbers. He saw the effort, the sacrifice, the sheer determination it took just to survive. "So, what do you want from me?" he asked finally. John didn't hesitate. "Not speeches, not promises. We need real change. Policies that don't just favor corporations but protect the people who actually put food on American tables." Trump was silent for a moment, then a small smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "Ever driven a tractor?" John raised an eyebrow at the sudden shift. "Not lately," Trump admitted. John gestured toward his old John Deere, a machine that had seen better days. "Hop in." Trump hesitated, then climbed up onto the seat. John handed him the controls, watching as the president gripped the wheel, maneuvering the heavy machine forward with careful concentration. It wasn't easy. The machine jolted slightly as Trump adjusted, his face tightening with focus. John leaned in. See, Mr. President, this is more than business. It's personal. Trump nodded, his expression more serious than before. I get it. John wasn't convinced yet. Do you? Trump looked out at the endless fields, his hand still gripping the wheel. Maybe not fully, he admitted, but I'm starting to. As they walked back toward the house, John wiped the sweat from his brow, feeling the exhaustion not just from the day's work, but from years of struggling to be heard. He had seen countless politicians come and go, all making claims to support farmers, but none had ever stood in his field, driven his tractor, or looked at his home and truly understood what was at stake. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe this president, for all his bravado and bold talk, was actually listening. Lisa met them at the door, her gaze shifting between the two men. Would you like to stay for dinner, Mr. President? Trump blinked, caught off guard. Dinner? John chuckled, shaking his head. We're blunt, but we're hospitable. Trump hesitated. His schedule was undoubtedly tight, and his advisors would probably object. But then after a brief pause, he nodded. All right. Lisa smiled. Good. You'll see what real farm food tastes like, John smirked. And hear more of my complaints? Trump laughed, the tension easing slightly. I figured. As they stepped inside, something felt different. John had spent years trying to get people in power to care about farmers like him. Tonight, for the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, his words had made an impact. But whether or not that impact would turn into real action was still to be seen. As the evening stretched on inside the Mitchell farmhouse, the conversation continued, shifting from tense confrontation to something more introspective. President Trump, seated at the well-worn wooden dining table, listened as John Mitchell laid out the realities of life as a small farmer in America. Lisa moved about the kitchen, serving up plates of hearty, home-cooked food, the kind that didn't come from fancy chefs, but from hard-working hands that knew the value of every meal. Trump took a bite of the mashed potatoes, nodding in approval at the taste, but John wasn't interested in compliments on the food. His voice was firm, unwavering, as he leaned in. You've heard our struggles, Mr. President, but what happens when you leave? Will this just be another visit? A nice story for the press? Or are you actually going to do something? Trump set his fork down, his eyes narrowing slightly. He wasn't a man who enjoyed being challenged, but there was something about John's directness that struck a nerve. I don't forget conversations like this, he said. John studied him, skeptical. We'll see, he muttered. The truth was, John had every reason to doubt. He had seen politicians come through small towns before, shaking hands, making speeches, nodding sympathetically before moving on, leaving everything exactly as it was. He had no interest in being part of some political theater, and if Trump had just come for a photo op, John had made sure to make it uncomfortable. But something about this visit felt different. Trump hadn't stormed out when John pushed him. He had stayed, he had listened, and as much as John hated to admit it, there was a part of him that wanted to believe the president was serious. As the evening wound down, Trump stood up, glancing at John with a smirk. Give me time, he said simply, extending a hand. John hesitated. Time was a luxury small farmers didn't have. But after a brief pause, he shook Trump's hand. We don't have time, he warned. Trump nodded. Then I better get moving. With that, he left, his convoy rolling down the dirt road, disappearing into the night, leaving John standing on his porch, arms crossed, watching the taillights fade. For days after, John tried not to think about it. He went back to work, mending fences, tending to his crops, paying bills that always seemed to pile up faster than he could handle. He told himself that it was just another visit, that nothing would change. Then, 2 weeks later, his phone rang. Wiping the sweat from his forehead, he answered gruffly, "This is John." The voice on the other end was one he immediately recognized. "John, it's Donald Trump." For a moment, John nearly dropped the phone. He steadied himself, gripping it tighter. "Mr. President?" Trump's voice carried the same self-assured confidence as always. "I didn't forget you. I've got something in motion." John's heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay cautious. "What do you mean?" There was a pause, as if Trump was enjoying keeping him in suspense. "You'll see soon enough." And just like that, the call ended. John stared at his phone, unsure what to believe. Lisa walked onto the porch, noticing the look on his face. "Who was that?" she asked, concern in her eyes. John smirked slightly, shaking his head in disbelief. "The President of the United States." Lisa blinked, then laughed softly. "Well, that's not something you hear every day." John nodded, his thoughts racing. Maybe Trump was just checking in. Maybe it was just another conversation. Or maybe, just maybe, something was actually happening. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't dared to feel in a long time. Hope. A month had passed since John Mitchell had received that unexpected phone call from President Trump, and though he had tried to push it to the back of his mind, a small part of him had held on to the possibility that something might actually come of it. He had been disappointed before, seen too many promises made and forgotten, but there was something different this time. Trump wasn't the kind of man to make a call just to ease someone's worries. If he said something was in motion, then John suspected there was more to it. Still, he didn't allow himself to believe too much. Life on the farm continued as it always had, the never-ending cycle of planting, tending, and trying to make ends meet. The struggle hadn't eased, the financial strain hadn't lifted, and John knew that, until something tangible happened, all the words in the world wouldn't mean a thing. Then, one morning, as he sat in his old truck listening to the radio, everything changed. "We have breaking news." The reporter's voice crackled through the speaker, snapping John to attention. "President Donald Trump has just signed an executive order aimed at protecting small farmers from unfair corporate practices." John's jaw dropped, his hands tightening around the steering wheel. He turned the volume up, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. The reporter continued, outlining the specifics of the order. Measures that would place restrictions on massive agricultural corporations buying up family farms. Regulations that would prevent unfair pricing tactics. And new funding allocated specifically to support independent farmers struggling to compete. John's breath caught in his throat. He had spent years fighting just to be heard. Years watching fellow farmers lose everything while corporations thrived. And now, for the first time, it felt like someone in power had actually listened. He didn't realize Lisa had stepped outside until he heard her voice. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her eyes wide with cautious hope. John nodded slowly, still processing it. Then, unable to contain himself, he jumped out of the truck. "He actually did something?" he said, almost in disbelief. News spread like wildfire through the farming community. Calls started pouring in from neighbors, from fellow farmers across the state, and then from across the country. "John, did you hear? This is real," one voice exclaimed. Another farmer, a man John had known since childhood, sounded choked up. "I never thought we'd see the day." Skepticism lingered in some conversations. After all, politics had let them down before. But there was no denying that something big had just happened. John found himself at the center of a movement he hadn't intended to lead. Farmers from all over wanted to talk to him, to know how it had happened, to understand how one simple letter had led to this. The media picked up the story, and before John knew it, reporters were calling, asking for interviews, wanting to know what it felt like to be the man who had challenged the president and gotten results. But John didn't care about the attention. He cared about the farmers who had been ignored for too long. Then, just when he thought the whirlwind couldn't get any bigger, a black SUV rolled onto his property. John wiped his hands on his jeans, stepping forward as the door opened and a familiar figure stepped out. President Trump extended a hand. "Told you I wouldn't forget," he said with a smirk. John shook his head, still stunned. "I'll admit, I'm impressed." Trump chuckled. "I don't just talk. I deliver." Lisa stepped onto the porch, her expression cautious but welcoming. "What brings you back, Mr. President?" she asked. Trump didn't hesitate. "I want to hear more. There's still work to do." John studied him for a long moment, searching for any sign that this was just a political stunt, but he found none. The president had returned, not for a photo op, not for a campaign rally, but because he actually wanted to understand what else needed to be done. They walked the fields together, much like they had before, but this time the conversation wasn't about problems. It was about solutions. "What else do farmers need?" Trump asked, his tone serious. John didn't hesitate. "Infrastructure, better roads to transport goods, irrigation systems that don't fail us, access to better equipment without having to go into crushing debt. Trump nodded, listening intently. "All right," he said. "Let's make it happen." John squinted at him, skeptical. "You're serious?" Trump smirked. "You should know by now, I don't joke about winning." John let out a breath, allowing himself for the first time to truly believe that maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. Meanwhile, news outlets swarmed the farm, eager to cover the story. "Why did the president return?" one reporter asked. John shrugged. "Because he actually cares." Not everyone was convinced. Critics called it a publicity stunt, claiming it was just another strategic move for headlines. But John knew the truth. He had seen the look in Trump's eyes, had felt the weight of the handshake that wasn't just for show. He had challenged the president in a way few had dared. And Trump had responded, not with words, but with action. For the first time in years, farmers felt seen. They felt heard. And John, a man who had never sought the spotlight, found himself at the heart of something much bigger than himself. Calls continued to pour in. This time, not just from farmers, but from officials, from policymakers who suddenly realized that the agricultural community wasn't going to be ignored anymore. And as John stood on his land, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time: hope. John Mitchell had seen a lot of things in his life, but watching the President of the United States return to his farm unannounced in a black SUV kicking up dust on the country road was something he never thought he'd witness. It had only been a few weeks since Trump signed the executive order protecting small farmers, and the news had spread like wildfire. Farmers across the country were still processing the fact that, for once, someone in power had actually listened. John had told himself that the fight wasn't over, that real change took more than one order. But he hadn't expected Trump to come back, especially not so soon. As the SUV rolled to a stop, Secret Service agents stepped out first, scanning the surroundings as they always did. Then the door opened, and Trump stepped out, adjusting his suit and walking straight toward John with that same confident stride. He extended a hand, his smirk unmistakable. "Told you I wouldn't forget," he said. John studied him for a moment before shaking his hand, his grip firm. "Didn't expect to see you back here, Mr. President," he admitted. Trump chuckled. "I had some unfinished business." Lisa stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, looking at Trump with a mix of curiosity and cautious optimism. "What brings you back?" she asked. Trump turned to John. "I want to hear more. There's still work to do." John crossed his arms, narrowing his eyes slightly. "You signed the order. What else is there?" Trump shrugged. "That was just the beginning." They walked together toward the fields, just as they had the first time, but this time the air between them was different. There was no tension, no hesitation, just a conversation between two men who both knew that words were one thing, but action was what truly mattered. "What else do farmers need?" Trump asked, his tone serious. John didn't have to think twice. "Infrastructure," he said. "Better roads for transporting goods. Better irrigation so we're not losing crops when droughts hit. Better access to equipment without farmers going into crushing debt." Trump nodded, listening intently, the way he had before. "All right," he said. "Let's make it happen." John squinted at him, skeptical. "You're serious?" Trump smirked. "You should know by now, I don't joke about winning." Lisa, watching from a distance, shook her head with a small smile. She had seen the doubt in John's eyes, the hesitation that came from years of broken promises, but she could also see something new, something she hadn't seen in a long time, a flicker of trust. As Trump and John continued walking the land, talking about what could still be done, the reality settled in. This wasn't just a political visit. It wasn't for cameras or speeches. The President of the United States had returned, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And for a man like John, who had spent years fighting to be heard, that meant everything. John Mitchell never wanted to be in the spotlight. He was a farmer, not a politician, not an activist, not someone who gave speeches or appeared on television. Yet after President Trump's return visit to his farm and the signing of the executive order that had shaken the agricultural industry, John found himself at the center of a movement that was growing faster than he could have ever imagined. The media flooded his phone with interview requests. Farmers from across the country called to share their struggles, and suddenly his name was being spoken in places far beyond the quiet town he had always called home. Reporters wanted to know how a simple farmer had gotten the President of the United States to not only listen, but to act. Some called him an advocate for rural America, while others accused him of being a pawn in political theater. John didn't care about any of it. He only cared about one thing, making sure that this wasn't just a moment, but the beginning of real change for farmers like him. Then, one day, the phone rang again, but this time it wasn't a journalist or another farmer. It was the White House. John Trump's familiar voice came through the line. "I want you on an advisory board." John was stunned. Me? He had never been one for formal meetings or government panels. He worked with his hands, not in offices. "Who better to represent real farmers?" Trump said. John hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm not a politician," Trump laughed. "Exactly." The weight of the offer settled in. He had spent his whole life working the land, fighting against a system that seemed designed to push small farmers out, and now he was being given a chance to fight from the inside. He looked at Lisa, who had been listening from the kitchen. She met his gaze, giving him a small nod of encouragement. Maybe this was his chance to make real change, not just for himself, but for farmers everywhere. After a long pause, John took a deep breath and finally answered, "All right, Mr. President, let's get to work." John Mitchell never set out to start a movement. He had been a farmer, just like his father and grandfather before him, a man who knew the weight of early mornings, endless work, and the constant fight to keep his land. But the letter he had written in frustration, the letter that President Trump had read, responded to, and acted upon, had changed everything. Now, months after that first visit, John found himself sitting in a boardroom at the White House, a place he had never imagined stepping foot in, surrounded by policymakers, advisors, and government officials. He didn't wear a suit like the rest of them. He didn't speak in rehearsed political phrases or soften his words to fit an agenda. He was here for one reason, to make sure the voices of farmers like him were finally heard. Trump sat at the head of the table, leaning forward. "John, tell them what farmers really need." There was no hesitation in John's response. "We need fair markets, not ones rigged against us. We need banks to stop treating us like risks while corporations get bailouts. We need infrastructure that actually supports rural America. Better roads, better irrigation, better access to equipment that doesn't bury us in debt." The room was silent as he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of thousands of farmers across the country who had struggled in silence for too long. For years they had been ignored, their livelihoods treated as an afterthought, their struggles dismissed as just another economic shift. But not anymore. The policies started to change, little by little. Funding was redirected to support small farmers instead of massive agricultural corporations. Protections were put in place to prevent monopolies from swallowing up family farms. Resources that had once seemed out of reach were now being made available. It wasn't perfect, and John knew there was still a long way to go, but for the first time, there was real progress. And it had all started with a simple letter. The news spread far beyond Washington. Farmers who had felt abandoned for years now felt a sense of hope. Calls continued to pour in, not just from reporters, but from people across the country. "John, you actually got him to listen," one voice said. Another farmer, a man who had nearly lost everything before the executive order, told him, "Because of you, I'm keeping my land." John didn't see himself as a hero, but he knew that his fight had become bigger than just his own farm. He had a responsibility now, not just to his family, but to every farmer struggling to survive. One afternoon, as he sat at his kitchen table, reviewing some of the new farming policies, he frowned. The changes were good, but they weren't enough. There was still too much uncertainty, too many loopholes that could be exploited by the very corporations they were trying to hold accountable. Then, as if on cue, his phone rang. He answered without thinking. "John?" Trump's voice came through the line, direct as ever. "I want your opinion on the next steps." John leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "We still need long-term solutions," he said. "Short-term fixes won't stop corporations from finding new ways to push us out." Trump was silent for a moment, then exhaled. "Then let's do something about it." John never asked for fame, never wanted to be the face of a movement, but he had become one anyway. Farmers across the country looked to him now not because he had sought out leadership, but because he had spoken the truth when no one else had dared to. He had written a letter expecting nothing, and in return, he had found himself in the middle of a fight that was bigger than himself. But he was ready. He had fought for his own land, and now he was fighting for all of them. And for the first time in a long time, farming didn't feel like a losing battle. It felt like a future worth fighting for. Life is full of moments that test our resolve, our patience, and our faith in others. John Mitchell's story is more than just a tale of a struggling farmer. It is a testament to the power of persistence, honesty, and the willingness to speak up when things are unjust. For years, he worked tirelessly, doing what his father and grandfather had done before him, pouring his heart and soul into the land, believing that hard work would be enough. But times changed. The world became more complicated, and the forces against small farmers became stronger. Many in his position would have accepted defeat, believing that one voice couldn't make a difference against the weight of big corporations and government bureaucracy. But John refused to remain silent. He put his faith not in a system that had failed him, but in the simple act of telling the truth. He wrote a letter not expecting a response, but because he needed to be heard, and that letter changed everything. There is a powerful lesson in John's journey, one that resonates with people of all ages, but especially with those who have spent their lives working hard, raising families, and trying to build something that lasts. It is easy to feel invisible in a world that seems to move too fast, where decision-makers often forget the people who built the foundation of society. Many seniors today may look at the challenges of modern life, rising costs, changing values, the struggle to hold on to traditions, and feel that their voices no longer matter. But John's story reminds us that one voice, spoken with conviction and truth, can still make an impact. No matter how small we may feel in the grand scheme of things, our experiences, our wisdom, and our perseverance matter. Another important lesson from this story is that leadership is not just about power or position. It's about listening. President Trump could have ignored John's letter, dismissed him as just another farmer complaining about his struggles. But he chose to listen, to engage, and, most importantly, to act. This teaches us something valuable about true leadership. It's not about making speeches or shaking hands for the cameras. It's about being willing to step into someone else's world, to understand their struggles, and to make real changes that improve lives. For seniors who have seen decades of political promises, this is a reminder that real leadership isn't found in words alone, but in action. John's story also reminds us of the strength of community and the importance of standing up for others. He didn't just fight for himself. He fought for every farmer facing the same battle. In life, we are often placed in situations where we can either remain silent or stand up for what's right. It is easy to feel that our problems are ours alone to bear. But when we speak out, we realize that many others share the same struggles. Whether it's protecting a way of life, advocating for fair treatment, or simply ensuring that our families and communities are taken care of, we all have a role to play. The older generation in particular carries the wisdom and strength that comes from experience. There is so much value in sharing those lessons, in guiding the younger generations, and in ensuring that the principles of hard work, honesty, and fairness do not disappear. Finally, John's journey reminds us of something deeply personal: hope. It is easy to become cynical, to believe that the world no longer values integrity and effort. But his story proves otherwise. A simple letter, a single conversation, and one determined voice created ripples that reached across an entire nation. It shows us that change is possible, that no one is too small to make a difference, and that even in the toughest times, there is always hope for something better. For seniors who have spent a lifetime working, raising families, and contributing to society, this is a powerful message. Your voice still matters, your experiences are still valuable, and the fight for what is right never truly ends.